All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to add some things to our recipe app. So, including nested form fields, we're going to use the Cocoon Gem, um, and we're going to add both ingredients and steps to our recipes. So where we left off, I had just installed jQuery, Bootstrap, and Popper, and I tested it by um, making sure that the Bootstrap modal functionality was working. That will tell us that Bootstrap CSS and JavaScript is working, and it is. So I'm going to go and I'm going to remove that modal from our index page. Um, just delete all that. So now we have our regular index. So right now, our recipes, all they have is a title and a description. What we really want to do is we want to add things that a recipe would have, like ingredients, list of ingredients, and a list of steps. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to use a functionality in Rails called nested form fields. And it is exactly what it sounds like. We're going to nest another model inside of the recipe model. So we're going to create two new models, one called ingredients and one called steps. And we're going to nest those inside of the recipes model. We're not going to create full scaffolds for ingredients and steps though, because we don't need all of the views. We don't need a show and an edit view and an index view for our steps or ingredients. We would only see steps and ingredients inside of a recipe, right? So they would always belong to a recipe and they would only be seen inside of a recipe. And therefore, we don't actually need to create full scaffolds. We don't need to create all of the different views for steps and ingredients. Hopefully that made sense. If it didn't, you can go back and rewatch some of my old videos or try to familiarize yourself a bit more with Rails. So what we're going to do is we're going to build ingredients and steps. So the first thing we'll do is we'll kill our server here. Hopefully we can kill it. There we go. Control C kills your server. And we're going to create the ingredients model. So to do that, we're going to use a Rails command called generate model. Rails generate model, and then we're going to call the model ingredient. And the ingredient model is going to have it's going to have a field called content, and that's going to be a text field. So what's the content of the ingredient? And then we're going to say the model will belong to recipe. So we do recipe : belongs to. You don't have to do it this way, but this automatically creates the associations in the model file. And I'll show you that here in a second. So we've got Rails generate model ingredient. So we're creating an ingredient model. It's got one field called content, and it belongs to recipe. So we're going to go ahead and generate that model. We can see when we got the green, we can see it created our ingredients model at ingredient.rb. So before we rake, we can, actually let's rake. So we'll rake. And when we rake in Rails 6, we get like dozens of warnings. And that's just a common problem, I think, with Rails 6 and Ruby 2.7. For whatever reason, but if you see, I'll show you after this rake completes. If you see these lots of equal signs and you see migrated, you know that your migration worked. So it looks like a bunch of errors, but we see that our migration actually did indeed work. So that's our ingredients model. We're going to do the exact same thing for steps. So we'll do Rails generate model, and we're going to call it step. And so our steps are going to have, I can't remember what I named the actual model or the actual content type. So give me 1 second while I pull that up here on my other monitor. Sorry about this. I just want to make sure everything matches my tutorial. So we called, we called the field, the column in this database table, direction. And each direction is a text field. And then we're going to do the same thing. Recipe belongs to, right? So this is going to belong to the recipe model. So again, we've got ingredients that have many that belong to a recipe, and we're going to have steps that also belong to a recipe. So that generated our migration file. We can rake db migrate, and that should execute the migration file. So when it executes the migration file, it actually creates in our database a new table called steps. And steps have a column inside of the table called direction, just to kind of clarify for you. So we should be good to go, and I can kind of show you. If we go to, you don't have to do this, but if you go to database and you go to schema, you can see in our schema, never edit this file by the way, but in our schema, we've got a new table called ingredients with a column called content. We also have these automatically created columns called they automatically get an ID because we said it belongs to recipe, so it gets a recipe ID, and the same with steps. It has a column called direction, and it also gets a recipe ID. This recipe ID is what associates our steps and our ingredients with each recipe. Okay. So we've created our model. Every time we create a new model, we have a few things to do in our model file and our controller file. So let's start with our model file. So if you go into the assets folder and you go into models, we can start with, well, first we can look at ingredient. We can see it automatically has our association here, belongs to recipe. We can go to step and it automatically has our association belongs to recipe. That's all we have to do for those. We don't have to do anything else for those. But let's go into our recipe model, and we don't have any associations on our recipe model that actually say that actually connect our recipe to ingredients and steps. So what we can do is in between the first and second lines, we can do has many ingredients. So we can say our recipe has many ingredients, and we can say dependent destroy. This means if we delete a recipe, we'll also delete our ingredients. Okay, I'm going to leave a space there, and I'm going to do the same thing with steps. Has many steps, dependent destroy. So again, if we've got, that's spelled wrong, destroy. If we've got a recipe and we end up deleting the recipe, we're going to delete or destroy the ingredients and steps along with it. So those won't stay in the database, which makes sense. And then the other thing we're going to do is we're going to use a Rails helper called accepts nested attributes for, and then we want to declare what we are accepting nested attributes for, and we're going to accept it for ingredients, and we're going to reject if all of the ingredients are blank, and we're going to allow destroy true. Okay, so basically this says we can add or remove ingredients. And so basically what the nested ingredient does, or I'm sorry, the nested attribute does, is it allows us to add more than one ingredient to each recipe. So we can add 100 ingredients or we can add 5 ingredients. Um, so all we're declaring here in our recipe model is that it accepts nested attributes. It accepts these attributes for ingredients. And if there's no ingredients, uh, if they're all blank, there's no ingredients added, we're just going to not do anything. And if we add an ingredient, we make a mistake, and we want to remove that ingredient, it's a typo or something, we can destroy that. Okay, that's all that's doing. We're going to do the exact same thing for steps. Instead of typing it in, though, I'm going to copy and paste it. And I'm going to view word wrap for you. And the only thing, obviously, we're going to want to change here is accepts nested attributes for steps, right? So we have our recipe. It's got a lot of ingredients, as many as you want. It has many steps. And it accepts nested attributes, meaning the the columns we created in the ingredients and the steps models, we can associate those with our recipe. Okay, so that's all we'll do in our model file. We can close that. We're going to go into our controller file, and we are going to whitelist our nested attributes. So Rails requires you to whitelist, let's see, word wrap. What Rails requires you to whitelist, meaning allow certain parameters, and if you don't, it just will not allow you to write to the recipe database. So basically in our controller, at the very bottom, we see this define recipe parameters. We can add we already have title and description, that's automatically created, but we can add our, let me move this, sorry, ingredients, attributes, colon, and then it uses this syntax of brackets. So inside of our ingredients attributes, we have an ID, we have a column called content, and we want to be able to destroy ingredients attributes, okay? And then next we have steps attributes, colon, and then we're going to use the same syntax of brackets, and we're going to allow ID, we're going to whitelist direction, and we're going to also allow destroy. Okay, so that is just whitelisting. That's allowing us to actually write to the database, the recipe database, through the controller. Okay, so we are good to go. I'm going to close that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to restart this server here and just make sure nothing broke with our new models. So what I will do is wait for this thing to boot, and I will reload our application. Nothing should really change. All we've done is associated the models, but I just want to make sure everything is not broken and everything is working just fine. So we'll jump back in, we'll kill the server, Control C to kill your server, and we'll jump back into actually executing or implementing our nested fields. So essentially what we want to do is in our form, oh, I killed it, I'm sorry. In our form, let me reboot this again, sorry about that. So in the form, we want to be able to add ingredients and steps. And we want to be able to add them dynamically, meaning if I have 5 ingredients and 4 steps, I don't want to have to I want the user to be able to add or remove as many ingredients in as many steps as possible. So to execute that, I'm going to use a gem called Cocoon, which basically uses jQuery um, along with this nested model to allow a user to add or remove as many steps or ingredients as they needed. So to add Cocoon, we're actually not going to use the gem file because again, anything really related to JavaScript, we kind of are going to go through Yarn because again, in the last video we talked about Webpacker a little bit. It's a problem with Rails 6. It's not a problem, but it's a new way of doing it in Rails 6. So we can't just simply do in the gem file add a gem that way that relies on jQuery. So that's a long-winded way of saying there's a workaround on this, and the workaround I found on the actual Cocoon support page on GitHub. But we're going to yarn add GitHub Nathan VDA /cocoon and then C24BA53. I will provide this in the tutorial. You can just copy and paste it. But we're adding Cocoon through Yarn instead of the gem file. Very similar to what we did in the last video with Bootstrap, jQuery, and popper.js. So again, instead of using the gem file, we're using Yarn to add these this JavaScript library. So what we'll do is that looked like it worked. We'll go back into our application in our development environment. And we're going to go back to application.js. So I'm going to close some of these up. And we're going to go to application.js. And we're going to import Cocoon. And I think we want that. And I think we need semicolons between, oh, that's not right, Cocoon. Between the imports, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, so that will import the Cocoon JavaScript that we need. Okay, so again, we haven't done anything. I'm going to run the server again and test it to make sure it's not broken. Nothing's actually changed in the app. We've just added the gem. But I'm going to run the app again, run the server again, just to make sure we don't break anything along the way. There we go. And let's let it load. Let's see. Seems like it's trying to load. There we go. So everything's working. Okay, so the next thing we'll do is we'll actually add these. Well, we're going to actually add the ingredients and steps into our form. So this is what we're going to do is I'm going to close everything for you so you can follow along easily. We're going to go into views, and we're going to go into recipes, and we're going into our form. So we want to keep our title and our description, but after our title and description, we're going to want to add ingredients and steps. So I'm just going to add a heading. We're going to style all this up in the next video, but I'll add a heading called add ingredients. So this is our form. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a form partial because that's the way the Cocoon gem is set up. So we're going to create form fields for, and this is a Rails helper, which just tells us we want to create fields for a particular nested model, and we're going to call the model ingredients, and we're going to create a local variable ingredient. Ingredient. And you could actually call it anything you want. I just like to call it ingredient because it makes it cleaner and easier. So this is where we'll render our partial. We haven't created the partial yet, but we're going to render a partial that we're going to call ingredient fields. And we're going to call the form ingredient, okay? And then we're going to end, okay? We're going to do this twice, but let's just start with ingredients and make sure it works. So we're going to render this partial. A partial is basically another file that gets pulled into the render tag, right? So whatever is in ingredient fields, which we'll create here right now, will be rendered right after add ingredients, okay? So it's a way of templating. It's a way of not having all of your code in one place, but templating and calling parts of code from other templates. So we'll save this. To create a new file, on your recipes folder, right-click and click New File. And we're going to save this file as a partial. To save a file as a partial, you start it with an underscore, and you'll call it ingredient. What do we call it? Ingredient fields .html.erb. Okay. So just like this form is a partial because it starts with an underscore, we're going to create a new partial called ingredient fields. So this is where we'll render our form fields for ingredient. So to do that, we have to use a couple classes that the Cocoon Gem relies on. So we'll just set these classes up real quick. And then we need div class field, not file, div class field. And inside of the field, we want the form label. And you'll notice we use the F instead of the form. And that is because that is how Cocoon has it set up. So we have the label for content. So as you can remember, we created a column in our ingredients field called content. And we will create the text field for content as well. Okay, content. Okay, so that will render the field. And then we also want to render a link that allows us to delete the field. And the great thing about the Cocoon Gem is it gives us a helper called link to remove association. And then we can, in the link text, remove ingredient. We're going to call the form, and then we're going to, and that's it. Okay, so we've created a partial called ingredient fields, and in that partial we have a form field called content. And we also have a link to remove an ingredient in case we accidentally added one that we don't want to add anymore. So that is what we needed to do for our partial. The only thing missing now is we want to add a similar link. So a link like we had remove ingredient, we need a similar link to add an ingredient. So we will link to add association instead of remove this time. And we can, in the field text or in the link text, add ingredient, and we are going to use the form syntax instead of F. Again, because we're in a different file, for ingredients. Basically, this is going to use the helper that the Cocoon Gem has created. And basically what it will do is it will call the ingredients form and it will use JavaScript or actually I'll use jQuery to add a form field when you click this link. And the same thing, it'll use jQuery to remove the form field when you click remove, okay? So now we're all set up for ingredients. Ingredients should be working. So what we can do is we can we got the server running already. So we can, if you don't have the server running, run your server, and we can either go to the edit form or a new form, and we can see that we broke it. So link to add association. Oh, you know what? Okay, so major no duh moment. You do have to, it turns out you do have to add the Cocoon Gem in your gem file. So I want to link to this as well, but this is sort of a hack. This is sort of a hack from the GitHub Cocoon repository. And when we added Yarn, we were able to set up the associations properly, but we weren't able to it still needed to install the gem file, the other files associated with it, in addition to the jQuery. So all that to say, add Cocoon Gem to your gem file. So gem Cocoon, go into your terminal and bundle install. That will install the gem file. You should have 18 gem file dependencies now, 76 gems installed, and that should get you going. So if you rerun the server, the only thing I added is so yours should look just like this. And when we refresh, we can add ingredients, remove ingredients. So the only thing I added, because the Cocoon Gem, if you look at the Cocoon Gem docs, if you add a class around the add ingredient link, add ingredient, a class of links, so div class links, it'll actually use some of the Cocoon styles to render the partial under add ingredients. So it's a long way of saying just add a div around your add ingredient link and call it links. So to do that, now we can see we can add an ingredient, pizza sauce, and we can add another ingredients like mozzarella cheese and Italian sausage. And if we decide, oh no, we don't want sausage because we're making this for vegetarians, we can remove the ingredient. And now when we add, click update recipe, it adds it to the database. Now, the reason why we don't see this is because we haven't updated our show view. So if we go into views and we go into show.html.erb, all we have being displayed currently is our recipe title and our recipe description. So when we go to the show, all we see is our title and our description. So to fix that, we need to output our ingredients. So to do that, we can do a couple things. We'll add an H3, and we're going to style this all up later, but ingredients. And then we want to, in an unordered list, So just in a bulleted list, we want to list out our ingredients. So we can create a loop inside of the list. So for each ingredient in recipe.ingredients. So basically what we're doing here is we're calling a global or a local variable ingredient that's using the @ sign. So for each ingredient in recipe for this particular recipe dot ingredients. So in the recipe ingredients column, we're going to, and we'll close the loop just so we don't forget to. We're going to loop a list item. So for each ingredient, we're going to create a list item, and we're going to print in that list item ingredient dot content. So our column inside of recipe.ingredients is called content. So we're going to, in each bullet, list out the content column. So if we refresh, we can see our ingredients now we got pizza sauce and mozzarella cheese. If we wanted to edit this and we wanted to break it, we can break it. So why did this break? Doesn't like the undefined local variable here in our partial. So let's go back into our partial. It doesn't like the F here. I don't know why, because it was fine before. We can try to change this to form, but I don't think that's going to work. So if we change these F's to forms instead, we can see if that fixes it. And it didn't like that either. Okay. Why is it doing this? I wonder if we go to recipes, if we create a new recipe. See, it works when we create a new recipe. Test, we can add ingredients. And it works. We can go back. But when we edit, it breaks. So let me pause it again and troubleshoot this real quick. Okay, I figured it out. I made a little typo in our partial render. So because we're rendering the partial via Cocoon, we need to change this form to the F variable. So if under it, we're in our form.html.erb. In our partial render, we got to change this to F instead of form. Okay. So if we go back to our recipes index, we can create a new recipe, test, and we can add an ingredient, 1, 2, 3, and it creates the ingredients, and we can edit. We can remove number 2, for example. That works. It's working now. Okay, so it was just one. It was 3 letters, but it broke everything. Again, change the form to an F. Okay. So for speed purposes, because this is getting long, let's add our steps and let's call it a day. I'm going to copy and paste this entire section of add ingredients, and I'm going to change this to steps instead. And instead of form fields for ingredients, we're going to call this steps, and we're going to call this step. We're going to render step fields, and we're going to call the local variable step, and then we're going to change this to add step, We're going to pull this from the steps model. Okay. So we just did the exact same thing with ingredients, but instead we changed everything to steps. We need to right-click recipes to create our partial again. We're going to save this as underscore step fields.html.erb. Save that. And we're going to pop over to ingredient fields, and we're going to copy all of this again. And we're going to copy this into step fields. So the only thing we need to change is remove, instead of remove ingredient, we're going to change this to remove step. And our column is not called content, it's called direction. If you remember that from the very beginning of the video. So we've got a label for direction and the text field for direction. So that should do everything we need it to do. So we've added steps in our form. Oh, we need to add it in our show as well. So I'm going to close everything for you because it's getting messy. We're going to go into views and we're going to go into show.html.erb and we're going to do the exact same thing. So we're going to display our steps, and instead of an unordered list, we're going to display an ordered list because we want steps to be numbered, but we're going to create a loop for steps. So for each step in the recipe.steps column, we are going to, and then we're going to close our loop. We are going to loop a list item, and we're going to say step dot direction. So we want to loop and print out inside of a numbered list item a step direction. Okay. So we've got our show, our form, and our partial. We should be good to go. So if I click edit, now we have, and this is so ugly, we got to clean this up in the next video, but now we have the ability to add steps. So step 1, step 2, and step 3. And, oh, syntax error. So instead of at step, we need a for. We forgot to add our for loop indicator. And if we refresh, we can do that again. So step 1, step 2, step 3, update recipe, and that didn't work. We can edit. Let's see what's going on. So we did not declare a local variable here because, so again, one little character broke it, but if we declare the local variable, we can refresh and this should work. Third time's the charm, hopefully. Step 1, step 2, step 3, update recipe. Nope. For ingredient, for recipe.steps. Okay, so that looks good to me. So the problem is somewhere else. Let's look in our form and make sure. Okay, we're rendering the step fields fine. Make sure this is text field for direction. That's being rendered fine. I'm going to go back and look in my database and make sure I've got the right variable name. Steps, yeah, direction, that's correct. So this is kind of how you would troubleshoot. You go through each part of the application. We can go to the controller. Maybe we didn't whitelist correctly, so we can view word wrap. Let's see, ingredients, attributes. ID, that looks right. Direction, destroy, that looks right. Oh, I spelled attributes wrong. The old whitelist. Okay, so steps attributes, not steps attributes. If you're following along on my written tutorial, you would have just copied and pasted that and you would have been fine. Um, but fourth time is definitely the charm here. So let's go step 1, 2, 3. Yay. So there's our steps in our numbered list. And let's make sure the remove works. And the remove works. All right, so we're good to go. It's ugly, but it works. So just to recap what we did, we created an ingredients model, a steps model. We added the Cocoon Gem that allows us to use jQuery to dynamically add as many or as little ingredients and steps as possible. And then we altered our views to display the actual ingredients and steps. So that's it for now. I will see you in the next.